by any means necessary.
Welcome back to By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik in Washington, D.C. I'm your host, Sean Blackman, here with Jackie Lukman. And as always, we are your guide to connecting the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. And we're back talking about the elections in Algeria. And for this conversation, we are joined by academic, organizer, and activist Brahim Rouabah. Brahim, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Now, Brahim, the presidential elections in Algeria have concluded with former Prime Minister Abdelmadjid Tebboune emerging as the victor. And interestingly, Tebboune served as the housing minister under Abdelaziz Bouteflika, who was ousted from his position after much protest earlier this year. And although Tebboune won 58% of the vote, leading up to the election, huge crowds, I believe thousands of people, were challenging the legitimacy of the elections, calling them a sham, saying the elections were rigged. One protester told AFP that Tebboune was worse than Bouteflika. Now, of course, that's just one person. But from your perspective, I'm wondering how you see the outcome of the election and how you think things may play out in the country under a Tebboune administration.
Well, it's important to remember that as far as the majority of the Algerian people are concerned, these elections are a masquerade, for the military junta to cloak itself with a new civilian facade. Today, as we speak, millions of Algerians are on the streets questioning the legitimacy of these elections and demanding the end of military rule. The five candidates that they had in this sham election were all four of them were ministers, including two prime ministers under Bouteflika's administration in the last 20 years, and the fifth was a high up official in student organizing close to the ruling party for decades. So really, what the military high command has been pushing for is an election to give itself some legitimacy, so it can take a step back and do what it has always done without having to face the heat from the streets. However, Algerians are not convinced by this. They've been on the streets, millions of Algerians, week in, week out, for the last 10 months, and that will continue to be the case for as long as their demands and for freedom, for a civilian state, for the military to step out of politics and perform its constitutional duties are not met. So for this election really will only complicate things, turning a blind eye to the millions of Algerians who are on the streets demanding a genuine change in which the popular sovereignty reigns supreme.
Definitely. And what you're saying, Brahim, I think speaks to, one of the central complaints from the protesters even before the election itself took place was that, the elections would be controlled by allies and people close to Bouteflika. And you were saying about how, the election of Tebboune sort of kind of complicates this process. And I mean, with the issue of the military and the protesters, it doesn't seem as though the political situation in the country is necessarily going to be ironed out anytime real soon.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. And I said, and I would sort of say again that this complicates things because the attempts over the last several months have been by the military high command is to divide Algerian people along ideological lines, along linguistic lines, and it's seen by the movement, the popular movement on the ground as a provocation. They are trying to turn a peaceful movement into a violent one, so to justify potential repression. the viciousness of the repression that we've witnessed and we've seen yesterday and today in places like Oran, which is the second largest city in the country, in the west of the country, where over 200 people were arrested. Rubber bullets were fired on protesters. Teenagers were beaten up and dragged down the streets. So the Algerians know that the over the last 10 months, the military rule, the military nature of the Algerian regime was exposed, and this election was only meant to give them some respite, so they can present themselves to the world, to the outside world, mainly as a respectable state with the functioning institutions, and present the sort of the country as a democratic, if you like, having a democratic facade.
Yeah, that definitely seems to be the case. And I'm glad you raised the issue of violence against the people in the streets from, the military and the police there. It's definitely an important piece because despite all of that, as you've been pointing out, the folks in Algeria are still very much in the streets, in throng, still, calling for real deep systemic change, which was, of course, their whole issue with this election. Maybe perhaps not so much the election itself, but the fact that it was obviously being controlled from those same elements that were causing a lot of issues to begin with. But Brahim, the fact that there's been so much violence against the protesters and they remain in the streets, it seems that, they're really poised to continue to be a significant factor in what happens in the country and in the politics of the country as they continue to push for those real sort of democratic changes that they've been struggling for the better part of a year at this point.
Absolutely. The movement can only get radicalized in the face of such intransigence on the part of the military high command and its foreign backers. It's worth remembering that over the last 10 months, not a single country in the world has made a statement about the situation in Algeria, where you have hundreds of political prisoners. Journalists are being thrown in prison. There is absolutely no freedom of press or of speech, of movement. There is no freedom of movement, where you have the military every Friday closing or cordoning off the capital to prevent Algerians from joining the protest in Algiers. So it's worth remembering that the military, the oligarchic elite in Algeria does not identify with Algerians. It's backed by foreign powers and corporations, and its interests are intrinsically linked with these international actors. So. And Algerians are very aware of this, and they are very aware of who their allies and who their enemies are. And they tend. The history shows that the Algerian people tend not to forget their friends, and much less their enemies.
Definitely. Well, thanks so much for joining us and helping us parse some of this out, Brahim. We're going to leave it there for now and move to a break here on By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik, but we will be back, so please stay with us.
By any means necessary.